let's start with the first talk of this first session of the workshop. It is a pleasure for me to introduce Roberta D'Alessandro. I think she's one of the few persons that that one doesn't actually need to introduce. We know her well. She's professor at the Utrecht University, and she has worked on many topics within the syntax semantics area, and she is now the PI of an ERC project on Microcontact, which is, I think, the topic that she's going to be presenting to us today. So, Roberta, whenever you want, you can take over.
Okay, thank you very much. It's so nice to be there, but in fact, I'm not there, so it's not so nice because I've seen names popping up. So, hi, everyone. I don't even see you, which makes it even more sad. I hope I can come and hug every one of you there because, as Angel said, I was very often there before this madness. So yes, I will tell you a little bit about this project. One disclaimer is that I'm going to look a bit on this side because I have a big screen and I'm not so good at looking at things. So if you see me like this, sorry, but I see better on this other screen. Okay, let me share the screen, and I hope this works because sometimes you will not hear the sounds. It doesn't really matter if you don't hear the sounds, but okay. Can you all hear me and see the screen? I don't see any of you because this is Teams and Teams is horrible.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, we use the same for teaching, so I know I'm talking to someone, but just to be sure. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about my project, and especially I will try to focus a little bit more on the methodology and on what we thought we could use in the beginning and why we shifted. And since parameters are part of the title, I will also mention a little bit what kind of change there has been. In the beginning, I was going all in with the parameter analysis, and now I'll try to show you that, in fact, I'm not quite sure anymore. But so let me tell you what I'll tell you about. So in case you're not interested, you can just go and take a walk and come back. I will tell you a little bit what I actually went back to the very first presentation. This project has been going on for about 4 years now, of which the first year was entirely spent on documentation in the sense of permissions, ethical protocols, data protection protocols, getting permits from various states to collect the data and export them, etc. And 1 year was entirely spent in pandemic. So, and that was the year in which we were supposed to go on the second and bigger field work. So it's been a struggle for long, but and I'll tell you where we started and what we discovered along the way. I thought, okay, the beginning, there was this hypothesis, then is there a better way to do these things? And I'll give you some of the results. We have many more, but there will not be time, and I will try to focus on something. Also because I wanted to present some ideas that I'm developing at the moment, also with Teresa Biberauer. And then I'll give you some generalizations that we found. So starting from the results, the things I will show you in terms of results are that first we identified 2 main strategies at work in changing contact. For resolution of conflict between 2 or more grammars. Let's talk about 2 grammars in contact. One, which is the one that it is not one strategy, it is a set of strategies that go in the direction of evolving the grammar. And whatever we know about it, they'll tell you. So there's a lot going on, but it involves similarities between grammars, typological similarities, and all these things. And then there is a strategy that we think is quite visible, which is rather a general cognitive strategy through which language change in contact happens. And this second strategy is more visible in contexts of microcontact, of which I will tell you about, and macrocontact. Okay, there's somebody talking, a child. That's is that Angelito? I don't see anything. Anyway, if speakers, sorry. This disappeared once again. Right. So basically, what I'll try to show you is if speakers are able to perceive the point of variation between two grammars, then whatever has been described so far in terms of changing contact holds. But when this is not possible, and when the strategy linked to interfaces, sorry, I'm getting a little bit distracted because I hear somebody talking. I think they're interrupting me or asking, and that's not the case. So if speakers are able to perceive the point of variation, then they go for one strategy. If speakers are not able to perceive the point of variation in contact, either because the variation is so small, because we're talking about contact between two dialects, or because the variation is so big in terms of differences in languages, as is the case of Creoles, then another strategy takes over. It is not that these two strategies are in conflict or in competition, but there's a tendency to go for one instead of another. Now, this all sounds very abstract, so let me tell you where we started, and then you follow a little bit what we got and how we got there. This is the beginning. In the beginning, I wanted to study what happens, or try to develop a predictive model of change in contact. This was my idea. It cannot be that change in contact is unpredictable, as it is mostly said, and also changing contact is part of this kind of change that shouldn't happen in grammar. I'm a generativist, and the way, I mean, it is a simplistic way of putting things, but once you acquire something, once you fix your parameters, that's your grammar. And actually, we all know that that's not as simple. There's a lot going on. There's a lot, especially if two grammars get in contact, a lot happens and change happens, and people, not just attrition, actually change, etc. So there's a lot of conflict. But I want, and also another thing you read, and I'll tell you, is that there's no way to predict what's going to happen when two languages enter in contact. This is usually what you find in those studies that are mostly typological, and these are devoted to study of changing contact, because the typologists were the ones that started doing this much earlier than us. Also, once you have your e-language, once you have your I language, that's it. So it is very hard to internalize e-language stimuli after a certain age, etc. Also, I wanted to look at syntactic change, because syntactic change in contact is usually the one that is studied less. Nowadays, it goes, I mean, with heritage studies, it is starting to become common to study change in contact, syntactic change in contact. But this was a project I wrote in 2014. In 2000, then it got delayed for several reasons. So we only started it in 2017. But then, back then, which is not so long ago, but it is 6 years ago, there wasn't so much going on. And basically, most of the things I could find were about syntactic change happens only if it is triggered or it follows some other change. So there's the inertia by Longobardi. There were discussions about, do you really need to have morphological, phonological change before syntax? Does syntax really change? What is the extent to which syntax changes? When do you start saying, okay, syntax has changed, so we are in a new language? This is what I read at the time. And in particular, I thought, okay, I want to compare, because change, okay, we are all human, we all share grammar, at least a language faculty, and change should happen more or less in the same way. So there are two main types of change that I focused on back then. Endogenous change, which is more or less what we call diachronic change, so the evolution of language, which is not triggered by anything, but it is just spontaneous. And then change in contact, which is in fact created by the clash or meet of two or more grammars. So the question that I had for the project was also, okay, I want to know what happens. I want to be able to have a predictive model, which is, I haven't got it. So the spoiler alert, you will be disappointed. But that was my idea. I got something though. And also the other idea was, is change a unique thing? Do change in contact and endogenous change, so diachronic change, do they go the same direction? Do they happen in the same way from a structural point of view? Is there some sort of generalized tendency, for instance, towards simplification, towards diminishing markedness? This is something that has been often pointed out, and it is happening. So sometimes some processes of change happen, and whatever the outcome is, it seems to be simplified. It seems to be simpler. So is there a general tendency? This is not really detailed, but this was the general question. And in fact, when you go and read about these things, I want to be quick, but I just want to give you an idea of where I started and where I ended completely in a different way. But these were the questions I had in the beginning, and this was what I had. And what I had is, okay, I read a lot of diachrony, etc., diachronic change, and the literature, the generative literature mainly, but in general, the literature on diachronic change, also typological, diachronic literature or historical linguistics is in fixation with directionality. So you read about grammaticalization paths over and over and over again. What happens? You start here, then you move, then you do. You can do it in a structural way, you can do it in a less formalized way, but that's it. It is about directionality. And also the causes and mechanisms of change. But causes are usually structure internal. Okay, you look for the path, and the key word there is really some sort of simplification. Sometimes it is parameter resetting, but so leave the parameter resetting. And one of the key notions there is language acquisition, which happens in the new generation. It is in the second generation, so it's children that kind of perceive some sort of difference. They are not able to parse the signal anymore, the input, the stimuli in the same way, because something becomes opaque. The morphology disappears. Imagine Latin to Romance, the usual story. You have basically a case that weakens, and then you don't hear the M at the end. Okay, so you cannot really know whether you have an accusative or a nominative. Then you start fixing the pattern, but before that happens, so children reanalysis, and this is children are the ones that make language change happen. And this is really a big thing, especially in generative grammar. Now, okay, now if we go to changing contact, you find completely different stuff. First of all, socio-historical factors are much more relevant. In that literature, you see a lot about converging languages, areas, language communities, and what can happen is basically everything. You can see that two languages converge, so two grammars converge, at least for some constructions, for some phenomena. You can have some sort of balanced language contact, so you can get some intermediate areas where you can get bilingual speakers more or less in a constant balanced situation, such as Catalan and Spanish. They're both bilinguals, but it is not that one language takes over, the other one disappears. One language can disappear, the other one can stay. There's language loss. It depends very much on history, on politics, on prestige, on the attitude of the speaker, on all sorts of things that have nothing to do with grammar. So, okay, there are several scenarios, and I don't want to tell you too much about this because you know it. But there are these phenomena. There are these phenomena whereby you have two separate languages, and you get some sort of exchange. So you get a new pattern without losing the old one. You get a new pattern, your new structure, an additional structure, but without losing the old one. Sometimes you have convergence, the Sprachbunds. All languages in a Sprachbund develop a common direction of change. Sometimes one language adopts entirely the grammar of another, and this brings to attrition and then obsolescence. This happens a lot with L2 speakers and heritage speakers, etc. But what is important is, okay, you have something that have to do with grammar, so pragmatic saliency, frequency, which I also put in grammar between among the grammatical factors, because there are some that are really not grammatical. Typological naturalness, it is easier to borrow from a language, to transfer from a language that is like typologically similar to yours than from a language which is a total different typological, morphological typology, typological type, morphological type. And there's about pre-existing structural similarity, a lot of things. But there are also a lot of factors that have nothing to do with grammar. Degree of knowledge of each other's language, kinds of contact, attitudes of the speaker, as I told you, so many things. So these are, as you can see, these two big pillars of grammatical, of study of grammar change, they don't talk to each other. These are two separate fields, okay? Now, when you go to the generative perspective on changing contact, you see a lot being done on heritage languages, especially in the last years. You see a lot about language acquisition, L1 and L2. You talk about attrition. You see a lot of attrition, but everything that has to do with change is a lot more cognitive, and it is a very different perspective. So the question I had back then is, can you tell when change happens because it is spontaneous or because of contact? Now, if you study two languages in contact, you study, I don't know, Italian and French in contact, and you start seeing that in some parts, in some Italo-Romance, this is totally made up, but it can happen. The auxiliary selection, or let's say, no, let's not leave French because they are similar, but imagine Italian and Spanish, an L2 speaker or an area in which the languages get in contact. This is fiction, but to tell you, or Italians in Spain, they start overextending have. Is this spontaneous because their auxiliary system gets tried somehow, or is it a direct influence of the fact that Spanish doesn't have auxiliary selection between be and have? How do you know whether they're copying the system, especially if they're simplifying, they're copying the system of the contact language, or this is just a simplification due to internal causes? And notice that there is a lot of tendency. There are a lot of Italo-Romance varieties that go towards have spontaneously. So how do we know that this is due to Spanish or not? Is there a way? Well, these were the questions. Now, I spent way too much time to tell you about this. So I will not tell you more than this, but I want to tell you just something. The idea was back then, okay, parameters. Contact forces reopening of parameters. The idea back then was like, okay, when you have language change, which is endogenous, you basically do it the Robertson Russo way. You start moving along your grammatical tree, etc. But whenever you have changing contact, you force the reopening of parameters. Parameters get open again, and then you reset them, basically. This was the idea. Perhaps that's what is happening. Now, now I want you to see that this is just there were a lot of questions that I started with. One was, what is the difference between changing contact and endogenous change? The other way is there a way to predict changing contact? And especially, is there a way to see what a specific change that we appreciate in a variety or in a language or whatever, is there a specific way to ascertain what this is due to? Is it spontaneous or is it contact induced? Now, if you compare two languages, it is impossible to know what this change is due to. And this is said not by me, but it's said by the biggest people, linguists working on contact, such as Eichenwald. These people, they say, well, to one, you are never going to find a way. Okay. When you go to heritage studies, what do you find? You find a lot of studies that have a lot of psycholinguistic background. So you normally have, okay, a phenomenon, a P or A in a language, in a heritage language. Heritage, by the way, is the language spoken by people who use this variety at home mainly, and it is not spoken by the community. There are several definitions of heritage, but normally I will refer here to the languages of the emigrants. So if you move and relocate, you and your family relocate, say, if you move to the US and you keep speaking your own language with your family or your small community, and all around you they speak English, but your family speaks Abruzzese, that's a heritage language. And you are a heritage language speaker. And so the heritage language studies were more or less like, okay, you study a phenomenon. What do? You create stimuli, some sort of not acceptability judgments, because heritage languages are not so very good, but you find a way to test whether this phenomenon is present, let's say agreement, long distance agreement, an Afro resolution. You find this, then you say, okay, there's this hypothesis, for instance, null subjecthood. This is due to the fact that whatever involves interfaces is too complicated, it cannot be processed. You don't find it, okay, the interface hypothesis is valid. You don't find this because of this hypothesis, that's fine. You basically, you check one phenomenon in one language pair. And this is what you see. Now, you have a lot of generalizations by now on heritage languages. We know that heritage languages tend to avoid indeterminacy. Heritage language speakers do not like to use words, polyfunctional words. So if you have a word like like that in Spanish and in Italian serves as a dative, as a locative, as a marker of whatever, a differential object marker, etc. Heritage speakers do not like that. They pick one, usually the prototypical meaning, the prototypical function, and they keep it. And the rest, they use other forms. There's the interface hypothesis I just mentioned, which has changed a lot, but more or less is always in the background. And it says that if a speaker has to handle a phenomenon that has a lot of modules involved, for instance, not just syntax, but also pragmatics, discourse, etc. So, for instance, the null subject, you do not just need to have a pro in your grammar, let's say. You need to know when to use it. That gives a lot, that puts a lot of computational load to the speaker. And the speakers tend to avoid this and converge and move towards a system which is an overt subject system. Because, of course, if you have a system like English where you always insert the subject, you don't need to start thinking and computing when you want to insert it and when not. You just insert it. It's simpler. There's another generalization, which is avoid silent elements, which says, yeah, they don't like prose. Pro in the sense that we use it. They don't like null subjects. Heritage speakers don't like null subject. They don't like ellipses. They don't like anything which is silent, because you need a lot of background, pragmatics, topicality, and a lot of notions. And this interface is difficult again. So you avoid, these are three principles. So when I started reading, okay, I leave this, the typological primacy model, etc., because they are not directly relevant. And I'll skip a lot because we have not so much time. But I want to tell you, when I started working and digging into this, and what we've been doing lately is, okay, first of all, you want to work on changing contact. Okay. The first step you have to do is to make sure that changing contact is one thing, so that all these generalizations that we know about heritage, because I decided to work on heritage, I'll tell you in a minute, are happening everywhere. So that contact is, at least contact is, it has several causes and there are several factors, but it is one thing. So more or less, yeah, everything goes is not fine. Okay, let's start from some generalizations that we found in heritage languages. Do they hold across the board? And in particular, we should consider a new dimension, which is microcontact. So what is microcontact? Macrocontact is basically what we call contact between two languages that are separate enough. I have no measure for this. It is, but more or less they're different enough. Microcontact is the contact between languages that are basically typologically identical. It's like if they were dialects of the same language. They belong to the same family group, and this is the operational definition. They are very similar, like Neapolitan and Spanish. They both have differential object marking. They both have ser and estar. They have very, very similar things, except one does differential object marking for definiteness, the other one does it for animacy. But, you know, it is really, really more or less the same grammar, the same structure. And the question was, is change in contact output the same in macrocontact and in microcontact? And the answer is no, it isn't. Microcontact, so contact between languages that are very similar to each other, is systematically, radically different from macrocontact. So we don't even have a general uniform response to change in contact for these little generalizations that we have. So is there a better way to study contact? Well, one way is to look at one phenomenon in one language, see what happens to this language in contact as an L2 or has a heritage. Okay, that's what we've been doing so far. Maybe we should rethink this methodology and select one input, select one feature at a time, but then check this feature against not one language, but many. So you have a one to many. One feature in a language in contact with many languages that are extremely similar to the language you are studying, except for some minimal variations that have to do with precisely that feature. In other words, I look at, say, auxiliary selection. Do we do it, or differential object marking? I take Neapolitan, it has it. Okay. In contact with Spanish, Spanish has it too, just for slightly different features. In contact with Italian, Italian doesn't have it, or perhaps it has it in some only another different. Catalan, different. Catalan is not in the picture in this project because we looked at America. Portuguese, yet another thing. But imagine this is the principle. Romanian, Romanian has it too, but it has a different marker than the usual Roman. So you start looking at really under the microscope at what you want to do. And ideally, we would have to, this is still the beginning, but I'll jump to the end very soon. We would have 2, 3 or more phenomena, possibly marked, because you want to see whether what happens to them also in diachrony. We want to have them observable in diachrony because we want to check that diachrony and synchrony are 2 different things. We want to have them in contact with similar phenomena within grammars that are exactly the same, but for these phenomena. Okay, now this is not completely possible, but of course, if you are within Romance, you have a good chance of finding these, right? That was the idea. Basically, grammars A, B, C, D, and E, feature X in grammar A in contact with grammar B, C, D, and E, where grammar C and D have exactly the same value for the feature, whereas B has another one and E has another one. So you can really track it down. You can really see whether change is happening because of the grammar of the language that is in contact or spontaneously. Also because you can check whether you have, you can track what happens, the diachrony of this phenomenon. Now, these languages exist, as I told you. These are the Italo-Romance languages and in contact with Romance. I selected these languages in the beginning. We had to change them many times for several reasons, but more or less the idea was, okay, there were a lot of waves of immigration to the United States and to South America. Now, the last one was in the 50s and 60s, so there are people still speaking these languages. Now, the languages I selected, as you know, Italo-Romance are different languages. This is not Italian. Italian is not in the picture. So these people speak these varieties that are varieties that have a literary tradition. Sicilian was written and spoken as a literary language before Italian even. Veneto was a language of the Republic of Venezia, etc. So they have a very, we can follow the development. And then we can check what happened to these languages that were spoken by the immigrants when they emigrated to Quebec, to Argentina, to Brazil, and to the US. And also what happened to them in Italy, because of course, after the 50s, that's when Italians started speaking Italian. So the good part about this is that when these people left, they left and they didn't speak Italian. They only spoke these varieties, what we call dialects, but they spoke only these. But when they left, the rest of the community started also speaking Italian. So there is no monolingual speaker of these varieties. They don't exist. And this is for whoever the reviewer could be among you who comes up with the idea that you want the control of pure monolinguals. They don't exist. Still, these varieties are really interesting. So we this way, what we could control for, so the timing was the same, the social historical conditions of immigration were the same. So we could observe the attitude towards the language was the same. They left contact with Italy, and that was the same. So basically, we could control for a lot of the social linguistic factors that usually determine and have an impact on language change. And that's what we did. Now, we started with crowdsourcing. It was the idea was, okay, we asked people to go to the youth. We asked Italian Institute of Culture to contact the youth, and they have to go to the elderly people, record them, upload them on the website, so we can find the right profile. This was very, very effective in Italy. A lot of people uploaded data, but we had almost no response in the Americas. We have a lot now, so you can go and look for yourself if you're interested. There's over 300 recordings of free speech of people. All of these scholars that you see are different Italo-Romance varieties in contact with Portuguese and with Spanish. We got a lot also for English. English we put as sort of control, because first we wanted to have something similar to French for null subjects, because all the other Romance languages are null subjects and French isn't. And also because America, in particular New York and Boston, are the only two areas where, and Toronto too, actually, in Canada. These are the, so US and Canada are the places where heritage language studies are actually being made, not in the rest. So we started from nothing. We had no contacts, we had no idea. Argentina and Brazil are far away. We couldn't find anything with crowdsourcing. This is the team. This is us. We had to do all this from scratch. The people that actually worked more on toward the organization and actually carrying out of the field work, which was really an enterprise, because Brazil and Argentina are slightly big, and it is not obvious that people are not speaking. They're not always the social linguistic situation. There's different. Italian in Brazil, there are communities, but Italian speakers or Italo-Romance speakers in Argentina are a completely different thing. So the people that actually have most merits in actually finding these speakers and interviewing them are Alberto and Francesco. Francesco went on a Francesco is now no longer working with us, but he went on a pre-field work just to establish contacts. Alberto moved the mountains to find contacts in Brazil. Silvia did the same, and it was really hard because Quebec is a completely different situation and language profile, etc. Jan went on field work to Gigi went on field work to New York. So we got a lot of data, luckily before COVID. The other people are research assistants. Breche now left. Many of them are known faces. The only person that linguists probably don't know is this guy, Julian. He's the IT expert. Now, we had the first data elicitation field work where we wanted to find the speakers and see whether these phenomena exist. Okay, we tried to check for the fluency of the speakers. We tried to design some elicitation, though we didn't know what to expect, so it was very superficial. We had forced choice, repetition task, interactive task, complete the sentence, pre-conversation. Remember, we're talking about people who emigrated from Italy in the 50s, 60s. These people are old. So after a while, they got tired. They didn't want to spend time telling us about sentences. So free conversation was the thing that worked best. we did get something. We had to record all the stimuli in all these languages because, of course, we speak a lot of languages, but they're very different. So we do not also, for instance, Jan and Alberto, they speak northern varieties. They cannot improvise Sicilian because the speakers will know. So we had to have all this stimuli recorded in all the varieties and also the instructions. So I don't know if you can hear, but was more or less what happened. I just make you hear this one. This was an instruction in Sicilian. This is what the speakers heard.
Ora vi facciamo ascoltare due frasi e andate a dire chi che vi pare meglio tra i due.
I don't know if you heard it, but that's not very important. It's in Sicilian. You're not going to understand it anyway. Now we had pictures. Not me neither. Then we had pictures for data elicitation because the phenomena we selected, I told you about null subject and differential object marking, and also we looked at pronouns, in particular at deixis. And deixis is a nightmare. So eliciting data for people that are not literate, because of course, if they're literate, they would have gone to school in Italy and they would speak Italian and that would be a third language. And we didn't want that. So imagine some 8-year-old who lives in Brazil, somewhere in a village, and you have to make them understand whether you want to understand whether they say this close to me, this close to the addressee, or that far away. Of course, you do it with some objects. That's fine. We did that, but the preparing before, we had to have the same data, of course, across all languages. We tried to make pictures, and these pictures are very beautiful, but they don't get it. Close to me, this is the speaker, this thing. What's that? This is so obvious to us. This means that she's speaking. Well, not quite, not to everyone. So there were a lot. We have papers on this. If you're interested, we're almost finished with revising a paper that has been accepted for volume, where we write everything we had. It was difficult. It was difficult because you had to talk with these people. Of course, we had not so much time. This was the first round, and we were supposed to go back there. We found, so the second fieldwork was made online, imagine, but we did manage because there were a lot of contacts established before. Data elicitation at a distance was possible for differential object marking and for subject lytics and all subjects, not for indexicals, of course. What we found in the beginning, so I presented this, I remember, before we started in Tromsø, and Itzia Laka said, how many people are you going to interview? She wanted to know, because of course you're setting up a big grant, how many people? And I said, I have no idea. And this was true because I had no idea. There was no way to find out. There's no register. We looked at Insta, we looked at all catalogs of immigration, we looked at everything. South America we don't know, is no man's land. We don't know for these things. There are some people working with some little communities, but it is not so easy to quantify. So in Brazil, we found 50 people, 50 speakers, 74 in Argentina, 36 in Canada, 58 in the US, with much less time because, of course, they're concentrated in New York, and then 8 in Belgium. I'll forget about Belgium. There's no time for that. So we interviewed in total 226 speakers in the first round. G1 is generation 1. These are heritage generation 2. As you can see, Brazil is mostly third generation. These people emigrated earlier than the people that emigrated to Argentina. People who emigrated to Canada are more, they all got exposed to English, and this is a problem, etc. So that's why we went to Belgium, but then everything exploded with this. So the e-field work, we got 29 in Brazil, 24 in Argentina, 4 in the US, 8 in Belgium. Now we had other elicitation, data elicitation and crowdsourcing, etc. Not much, but a lot. Because we really had to, our field workers had to go on field work, like take a bus, go to a place, take a car, drive somewhere, wait there, bring the equipment. It is not, it wasn't so easy, right? The empirical generalizations, what did we find about that? And I'm not going to tell you much about this because there is no time. No subjects in contact, remember, they don't like them. What did we find in Veneton, Friulian that added along the way, Sicilian, Calabrian, Abruzzese, etc. They tend to get lost. That's the claim in Macrocontact. More overt subjects than the baseline. That's what we expected. Differential object marking tends to get lost. Many studies were made in Russian in contact with English and Spanish in contact with English, and they tend to disappear. Deixis indexicality is not affected by contact. These are the claims in the literature. And highest functional heads, those that are related to indexicality of some sort, like tens, etc., or D, they also tend to be retained. What we found, no subjects in contact, in fact, they increase. Our heritage speakers in Microcontact started inserting null subjects where there weren't. They started dropping the clitics that in the meantime had become pronominal. So we found clitics in Friulian and in Veneto that passed all the tests for being full pronouns, and the speakers started dropping them in topic continuation. So topics were there, yes, but prodrop was created in varieties that didn't have them, in the sense of, they didn't have them. Differential object marking increased. Well, of course, in Argentina, they differentially object mark anything. So, of course, this is increased, but it started appearing even in Brazil, even in other contact situations, in languages like Friulian. Friulian is a northern Italian variety. It is a Reto-Romance variety. It is a doesn't have differential object marking is not there. They started again in topics, which is not strange, but it is strange according to the literature. Deixis indexicality, nothing happened. So whatever happened is exactly the same that happened in diachrony. You can really track it down. In fact, Silvia Terenghi, who's in charge of this, she really looked, and it is actually nothing happened. Tripartite systems reduced to bipartite system, but like in diachrony, nothing happened as expected. Whereas we got a lot of D drop, T drop, and C drop, especially in contact with New York with English. Now, change in contact is itself not a unitary phenomenon, and not just in the idea of what are the speakers doing that we care so much about, and the profile of the speaker and when they started speaking, etc. But actually, grammars, they have different grammatical output. Okay, so results in 2 minutes. I already told you. Prodrop in contact with non-prodrop, you usually find more of the overt prodrop insertion. You do have some extension of prodrop in Macrocontact too. That's been documented by Montrul, for instance. But mostly you have no prodrop. You go towards the English system, let's say. And actually, we found exactly the opposite in Microcontact. Now, leave this because there is no time. If you want to know more, we looked at 580 sentences. Alberto Frason has a lot of publications on this. We have joint publications, etc. But remember the name Frason because that's where you'll find all information about null subjects, subject clitics, agreement clitics, becoming full pronouns and being dropped. This is what I want to show you in Topicality. This is heritage speakers. This is generation 1 topic continuation shift of these subject clitics. This is generation 2 in Argentina, and this is generation 2 in Brazil, or heritage, sorry. So you really see a drop in topic continuation of null subjects, of subject clitics. You start seeing null subject emerging. So Microcontact is a different thing. Differential object marking, as I told you already, it doesn't disappear, it gets preserved or enhanced. And the work has been done a lot by Luana Sorgini. So if you want to know, read what she wrote and listen to her talks. This is just for you to know that this work has been done and the generalization is remains stable or increases. Again, where does it increase? Here in topics, in topic position. And that's very important. Topicality is key, is the key to everything. Okay, so generalizations. Now, do I have 3 more minutes, Angel? I don't know if Angel is there. Okay, I'll take 3 more minutes because Angel is probably not there.
Yes,
or maybe he's there. Okay, you're there. Can I have 3 more minutes?
Or 5, yes, whatever you need.
Good, because I want to give you some generalizations and show you how different, what a different direction this took. So null subjects in macrocontact, so in contact, normally what we study, heritage or contact, L2 or Russians in England, in America, let's say. They're weakened. They rarely stay unaffected. In microcontact, they either stay unaffected or they get strengthened. You start seeing null subjecthood all over the place. Now, another interesting thing is that where you see null subjects, whether there are null subjects, usually expletive subjects, but anyway, if you see them in creoles, you see them also in topic continuation contexts. So this topicality is one thing that keeps coming back. Differential object marking in contact is weakened. In microcontact, it is enhanced. In which context? In topic continuation context. So all the new traditional topic. Extreme microcontact creoles, if they have differential object marking, they have it with topics. Deixis doesn't react, which created a lot of discomfort in Silvia Terenghi, who studied this, and now she actually has an excellent analysis of pronouns and their evolution and demonstrative, so go read it. But if you want to find something spectacularly new about microcontact, you will not find it because it didn't happen. So topicality, leave indexicality for the moment, focus on topicality, but also indexicality, they are always there. Indexicality stays fixed, more or less. Topicality plays a role. Now we know that topics is where things change. Topics is where no subject disappears. So topics are there, they're there all the time. But the problem is not that we don't do null subjects, because we cannot handle topics as heritage speakers. In fact, heritage speakers can handle topics very well. And what is the reason? Well, the first idea I had is, okay, why there's this difference between microcontact and macrocontact? That's because the perceived typological similarity, you can't quite pinpoint what's the difference between Neapolitan and Spanish, because they're basically doing the same thing, and it is such a micro featural difference that you can really not pinpoint it. But then actually, and whereas in macrocontact, you can't pinpoint it either, because languages are so different that you can't quite focus, of course, unintentionally, on what the VP looks like, right? You can't really see it. Whereas in two pairs of two languages, there is an easier way of perceiving the similarity and the locus of variation. Therefore, you just go towards all the generalizations that we found, simplification and whatever you want. But this topic is something that bothers me, because why topic? Well, basically, topics are they needed for communication? Not clearly. So there's a very interesting paper by Krivka 2008, where he shows that actually this idea of dividing things in given and new, which is the basic idea of topics, no more than that, is actually part of human language, but of no other system of storage, no other database. Nothing works like old and new. Old and new is something we use as humans. And actually, topics seem to be universal. So there's a way of marking topicality and perceived topicality in all the languages of the world. Topics are there in creoles. Topics are there, are marked or unmarked. There's a way to distinguish topics via word order, whatever you want, but topics are there. So I'm thinking now with Teresa, actually topics are of course peripheral, and they are on the phase edge. We know that phase edges are accessible directly by the interfaces, and these are more accessible by the interfaces. Teresa has a lot of study on the language change and LF syntax interface, and the fact that the edge is the most visible. I have some studies with phonologists, with Mark van Oostendorp and others, showing how prosody really reads the face edge and not the face complements, for instance. So the edge is the place where change penetrates, where the interfaces penetrate. So actually topics are where change, where innovations, where new regularities emerge, where speakers cannot make sense of regularity, cannot make sense of two different grammars. That's where you create regularities. It's not where you lose things. That's where you create, where you innovate, you enter through the edge, and you enter through topics, because topics are something that everybody has. They're part of our faculty of language. Maybe they're just cognition, maybe they're just what we need. Now Teresa thinks that that's because we need to make the distinction between what is old and what is new, so we need to create the contrast, and so use maximize minimal means. I also think that perhaps topics is something that is given because you need to link. You need to link, so indexicals are there because you link yourself to the world around you. Topics are there because you link what you're saying to what you said before. There's a way of linking which is not unique to language, so probably this is a third factor. What matters is that it is there, and that's what speakers in contact, heritage speakers, resort to when they want to create new regularities. So this is what we found. Now, how does this have to do with parameters? Well, you can say macro parameter of old and new is there, but actually this is not quite the way I think you can use parameters. These are not reopening of anything. This is really about the way our grammar is structured rather than fixing. I mean, there's a lot more to do, let's say, if we want to express this in terms of parameters. Okay, that's all. I tried to show you actually basically where we started and where we ended, and it's completely a different direction, but I hope to have shown what we have tried to do to tackle all our problems. And I'm happy to tell you more in details in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Roberta, for your talk. And now we have some time for questions. Just use the icon you have to raise your hand and then unmute the mic.
And perhaps also show your face, because talking to darkness,
Ricardo,
I see.
Ricardo Chepare. Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm supposed to have the camera on. I don't know whether you see my face or not.
No, I don't see it, but I would very much like to. If you can, no problem, because I know it's you. Your voice is.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but the camera seems to be on, so if you don't see it, I don't know why it is.
Go ahead.
Let's not waste our time.
Yeah.
I was interested about your claim that topichood may be part of the motivation for change in many of those cases, and and the link you make with the face edge. The concepts are not exactly the same, right?
No.
So I'm thinking, for instance, of one very particular property of what have been called Euroversals. So people who have looked at Europe as a linguistic area. And one particularly intriguing thing about that area is that they have both definite and indefinite determiners. So if you look typologically, say at Walls or at other big generalizations about the development of determiners, you have languages which have no determiners, languages which have definite determiners, languages which have indefinite determiners but not definite. It's very rare to find languages which have both. And they are mostly concentrated in Europe. And in fact, they also arise in languages which are non-Indo-European, like Basque, but which have been in contact with, in this case, Romance languages. So it really seems to be a universal. Now, the question then would be, is topichood or its face edge? So, I mean that indefinite determiners are also determiners. And in that sense, they also set up face edges, right? So what is the important factor? Is it topichood or is it face edge?
For determiners, I wouldn't even go so far as to say that topic is involved. It could, in case of definite determiners, but it could be just a matter of indexicality of the D head or something like that, which is yet another. I mean, I didn't say that topic is the only way. A topic is the one that we could pinpoint, and it happens to be at the edge. D could be another head that is, because D, I mean, what Sylvia tried to show, actually showed, I think, is that the D head and this sort of definite, indefinite, etc., that's really stable. you don't touch it, you don't move it, you don't change it. And I mean, so it is probably the idea that you want to link and you want to have a definiteness there. And I don't know if this is, I have no idea because I don't know about that. But I mean, just to clarify, this is not the idea was not that everything only happens through topics. The idea is, okay, topics, usually topics in the sense of continuation topics, or I mean, we see it in romance, dislocation, etc. too. It is not by accident that they are at the edge, because the edge is the place where you speak more easily to LF and PF. But I wouldn't be able, I mean, this is a very interesting thing.
Okay, no, fair enough. I agree with your view. The reason I asked is because it seemed that indexicality was like something you don't really change in principle. If I understood your table.
No, the point is not, I mean, it is not that topics change. So both topics and indexicals are there. So you use topics to introduce your changes, and that's because they are at the edge. And indexicals, you might use, you don't use them to introduce your change, probably because indexicals are more easier to process, etc. It's easier to say you in front to the person in front of you, etc. But what I try to say is that what if a speaker doesn't know what they have to do, they have two grammars in context and they don't know what to look for differences, they resort to what is there, which is topicality and indexicality. Now, the fact that they change or not change depends on their nature. But what I wanted to say is that topics are there. Topics are always there, and that's why they are used for changing. Why they don't use indexicals? Well, because indexicals are, I don't know, because where Silvia has an idea, it has to do with how close the person is to the root, etc. There is an explanation, but probably it's because indexicals are easier to process.
Okay, thank you, Roberta.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a question by Janneke van der Waal. You can unmute yourself, I think.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Roberta.
Hi, Janneke.
Nice to see you. And thank you. It's good food for thought. I really like it.
Thank you.
I noted you said if speakers cannot perceive the difference in microcontact, then they don't follow the macro pattern and instead rely on the general cognitive principles or communicative principles. So I was wondering what makes that that people don't use that in Macrocontact, or use it to a lesser extent, or what's happening there?
It's a very good question, and in fact, I mean, it is not a matter of not using, so using Macrocontact, you say it correctly, it is not that we found that Macrocontact never has these strategies, or that Microcontact never shows, for instance, emergence of overt subject. You have it, but to a much lesser extent. It is really reversed the pattern. So what makes you decide? Well, one thing that we thought of is the perceived typological similarity. That is the model that also Jason Rothman uses, etc. So when you feel, when the speaker actually perceives general typological similarity, you tend to transfer from the language that is closer to. So if you have a third language, for instance, and L1, L2, and L3, you transfer to L3 from L1 or L2, depending on which one is more, it's perceived as more typologically similar. And then what my idea, my intuition is that, for instance, if you feel the difference, because you feel the similarity, so you also feel the difference, you can identify better, you can focus, because if you only have one other competitor, you can focus, you can, probably it's a little v that you focus on, you can identify your little v as a speaker, which is different. You can identify the object easier if you have only one language. So basically, imagine I am Russian and I'm speaking English. I have differential object marking, English doesn't. I can recognize the boy and the boy in English at some point. I see the difference and then I perceive, okay, there's a difference there, and I start changing in the direction of English, which is usually what happens. So you use this and you have the strategy. If I speak a language, which if I'm if I'm Napolitan and I speak Spanish, I will never perceive anything. I will not perceive that it doesn't apply, this typological similarity. I think it is the same language. So I will go on doing what I did, or at least I will start introducing new things because I have no idea. I will just go learn the language as if it was my own. I think the interesting part is Creoles, where you actually, if you feel the difference, you say, okay, this is different, but this other language is yet different, and the other one is yet different, and then you really have the pool of options, and then you don't know where to look, and then what you do is, I just start introducing change in something I know how to use, which is topics. That's the intuition. Why exactly they choose this particular strategy? Well, that's the question of all questions. If you find out, let me know. But that was the idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if there is any other question. We should have time for a short question if you have one. Otherwise, we can leave it here and thank our speaker. Thanks, Roberta.
Thank you very much.
Your talk.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye. I mean, I'm here, but bye in the sense that I will not be talking and seeing you. Ciao, ciao.
Okay. No, so we can now have I would love to have a real coffee break with you guys, but now there's an online break, so we can resume. I mean, the next talk it's at
there 6 are messages, Angel. Angelito, there are
I'm
messages.
not seeing them. Oh, really?
I don't know. Questions, maybe.
No, but I don't.
No. Okay, if they say thank you, okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Okay, guys. So we can resume at 5:50, 10 minutes more or less before our next talk by Lauren, and then we can have a virtual coffee break. So we can get up and get ourselves a coffee or something like that. That's the advantage of doing things this way. Okay, so let's resume in 20 minutes. Okay. So thanks again, Roberta.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's continue with our next speaker, Lauren Ackermann. She's from the University of Newcastle, and she has been working on an area where we can find interactions between parsing strategies, grammatical information, and contextual information. And she has worked on topics like pronouns and gender, ambiguity, resenting pronouns, and others. And the title of her talk today is exploring syntactic microvariation and hierarchical cluster analysis. So, Lauren, when you want, you can take over.
Oh, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Let's see whether I can share my screen. I've not done this on Teams yet, so I'm not entirely sure what it will look like. Oh, goodness. So it wants to know which of my screens I'm sharing. I don't think that's the one I want to share. Let me try that again. I apologize, my computer seems to be running slowly at the moment. Hopefully this will work. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, so you see the one that says exploring syntactic microvariation?
Yes.
Fabulous, thank you so much. Okay. Oh, goodness. I've got too many screens. I've just started using a second monitor, and so I'm a little bit of a mess. And then on top of that, I know you're not supposed to apologize at the beginning of of talks, but I also have a bit of pandemic brain, so we'll see how this goes. But thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm surrounded by looms, and so hopefully I can do them justice. But in my talk, I'm actually going to be speaking about something I am not quite an expert in yet, and that is sort of my expertise. So Angel says that I work with processing and the parser and pronouns, and that's true, but really my focus is on interfaces and building bridges between disciplines that aren't very strong, and I can see ways in which they connect. So I'm going to talk about how my talk fits into this workshop, in my mind at least. I'll give you a little bit of the background about what inspired the project, how we gathered the data, and then most importantly, how we ended up analyzing this data. And then I'll give you a little bit of a discussion about what I've learned from this and the limitations of the study, and hopefully some ways forward as a conclusion. So the way I see this talk fitting in is that much formal syntactic work, of course not all, but much, is really rooted in qualia, such as acceptability judgments, often by a single person, such as the author, or by a small number of individuals, usually familiar to the author. And this is an excellent way to study individual grammars as sort of like an iLanguage case study. And if you gather enough of these qualia, you can detect broad patterns across many iLanguages, usually discussed as sort of a homogeneous speech community. And this allows you to identify potential generalizations within a population, which can then be further tested with more coarse-grained behavioral analysis, such as reading time studies. And I say this is coarse-grained because you've got to analyze it across a number of participants and across a number of items, such as sentences, rather than looking at a single participant's interaction with a single sentence. Now, this sort of method is not actually that great for some things. It's not very good at identifying communities that vary together in certain ways, or sub-communities, really. And therefore, narrower patterns across many or even just a few iLanguages end up getting obscured in the noise, as noise. So it doesn't allow you to really describe the contingencies of these generalizations. Like we see certain phenomena happen in this scenario, except when XYZ, maybe we can't identify that because there's too much noise in the data that's been gathered. And therefore, fine-grained analyses are more difficult to or to use. So in my experience, using experimental syntax as a tool to dive into the grammar or a grammar and identify what parts are behavioral and cognitive and what parts can be attributed to specific linguistic properties. This is a very well-established method for looking at broad community level patterns and between participant behavior, both like in the psychophysical range and at the conscious behavioral range. But it's less well established for looking at individual iLanguages or finding these fine-grained patterns. And so enter the study, which I'm using as a framework for this talk. So Tracy Connor is my co-author and in fact the lead on this project. So I will direct you to her to with any questions you have about the formal syntactic background. She approached me to join this project specifically for my methodological skills. So I will be addressing the methodological issues that we encountered as well as the analytical issues. So our paper, which is currently under review, is called Apparent Raising out of Do-So Anaphora. So Do-So anaphora have typically been categorized as deep anaphora. And I'm not going to go into much about the definition of that or how people conceptualize the structure and or where they fit into the tree, where they're base generated, how things move around them. Rather, I'm going to look at the observations that have been made across this literature across decades. So it seems to be that there are three, or at least three conditions or three types of verbs that we can categorize based on how they interact with this do so. So there's raising out of agentive verbs, or I should say when we look at raising rather than control. And the agentive verbs I'll be discussing are claim and pretend. And when we raise out of these agentive verb environments, do so seems to be acceptable to use as an anaphora, as an anaphor. The other sort of verb is the raising out of state of verbs environment, and the verbs we'll be using here are tend and happen. And in this environment, so is unacceptable. Now, there's a third case, which is also looking at state of verb environments, but these verbs, such as seem and appear, seem to create some sort of unstable or variable acceptability judgment. So the examples for these, the agentive one, the acceptable one, would be something like, Bill pretends to be angry and Joe does so too. And the literature broadly reports that this is an acceptable sentence. Now, the state of verbs that are unacceptable could look like, Bill happens to be angry and Joe does so too. And this is generally accepted in the literature to be unacceptable. And then the variable or questionable version of this would be, Bill appears to be angry and Joe does so too. And it's not clear whether there is a consistent judgment on this. So from these observations, we want to ask three questions, the last question being the most important for us right now. The first one is, can we experimentally detect the difference in acceptability between the proform do and do so? Then our second question, can we experimentally detect the difference between agentive and stative verbs when paired with do so? So this sort of takes a look at only the foundational idea that agentive and stative verbs do have this distinct difference in judgments, the acceptable ones and the unacceptable ones. Then finally, we did a deep dive, well, we started to do a deep dive into the sorts of variation that can be experimentally detected within the variable condition. So these are stative verbs that when in this raising environment and when they're paired with do so, seem to elicit variable or uncertain judgments. And this is what I want to focus on most for the rest of the talk, because this is, at least as far as I know, a fairly innovative sort of question for the formal side of syntax. And while there are works in the more experimental and psycholinguistic side that look at this, they don't do so in They don't do so in such a way that necessarily feeds back into the formal theoretical approaches to identifying what parameters allow one thing to happen or another thing to happen in different environments. So taking a little bit of a broader look at the purpose of the study before we dive into details, I want to investigate microvariations as apparent instabilities. So we see these instabilities. No experimental syntax is ever perfectly clean and clear. It's never 100% one thing and 0% another thing. There's always noise. And so perhaps this noise can be something interesting. So I ask, are unstable judgments this variable condition where it may be in free variation or not really attributable to any other factor? Or maybe they're conditioned by narrow grammatical contexts. Maybe they're acceptable only in certain environments, and we just haven't identified what makes that difference. Perhaps even something as broad as having some being presented with linguistic context like a preceding sentence rather than a sentence in isolation. Another possibility is that this variability is dependent on the linguistic register that your participant or that the receiver of this sentence is imagining or is embedded in. So there is a suggestion that written and spoken language could elicit different sorts of acceptability judgments for do-so anaphora. Another possibility, which is the one that we're particularly interested in now, is whether there are actually stable subpopulations or different microdialects that have different judgments that have been dismissed as noise in the past with between subjects analyses because they're smaller than the main judgment, or because they just haven't been identified in a way that we can in a principled way, identify and seek out and elicit judgments from. So the question is, how can we tell which of these things are affecting our data? And in the background of the slide, I have sandpaper from a very coarse grain 40 grit to a very fine grain 200 grit. And the reason is because we are still at a very coarse grained stage of refining this question and this methodology. And there are disciplines that use this sort of methodology, but introducing it to these sorts of questions, it takes a little bit of refining. And so this study, we start at a very rough 40 grit, and we end up introducing a lot of scratches and blemishes to the thing that we're sanding, our question. But hopefully the goal is, just as you do when you're sanding something with sandpaper, you gradually increase the value of the grit, the gauge of the grit, and eventually you get something very smooth and polished. And we're not there yet, but hopefully this talk will give you an idea of how we've gotten to the stage we're at and where we can take it next. So, on to the experiment. I have to give you full disclosure. This experiment started off as simply a pilot study. We had this question we were curious about, and so we did not gather as many participants as we would have if it were a main study or the core of this study. But this is how it started out, and then as the pandemic has influenced our workloads and our responsibilities, it is going to have to stay at this stage for a little while longer. But we started off with gathering data from 40 participants from North America, so the United States primarily, but a couple from Canada. And we presented them with items in a 3x2 design. And the verb type has 3 levels. This is the 3 types of verb environments: agentive, stative, and what we're calling variable. And the anaphor condition has 2 levels. Subjects were either presented with does or does so in their sentence. And you can see an example of this sentence that that they would have been presented with at the bottom. Now, because there's 2 verbs for each of the 3 verb type levels, this ends up being 12 different conditions per item. So subjects were only exposed to 1 of these 6 verbs and 1 of the 2 anaphora for each trial sentence, of which there were 24. So each subject sees 24 sentences with 1 of the verbs and 1 of the anaphora, and they never see that sentence again, but they will see other verbs of the same type and other anaphora of the same types. But since we're interested in only 6 conditions, we're collapsing the 2 verbs for each condition. And so it makes it a little bit more analyzable. And this is because we don't actually have any ideas of how claims and pretends, for instance, would differ from each other. This is something that we don't yet have the refined hypotheses for yet, but hopefully will in the future. And then, so these sentences were presented to our subjects, and they rated the sentences on a 7-point scale, where 1 is unacceptable and 7 is acceptable. So that's they are instructed to rate things as from unacceptable to acceptable. And again, a very common experimental syntax procedure. The novel, innovative stuff comes in a little bit. And so I wanted to give you just a moment to brace yourselves and prepare, because I'm about to show you a bunch of graphs that I sometimes have trouble explaining, because they are in some ways very unintuitive, but they are also the best ways to visualize this sort of data. So to get started, for our first question, whether or not we could even detect a difference between the do condition and the do so condition, I have visualized the data as such. We've got 2 columns, they're stacked, with unacceptable ratings with paler colors and more acceptable ratings with darker colors. On the x-axis horizontally, we can see do is on the left and do so is on the right, and the count number of responses for each of those conditions is stacked, so that we have the same number of responses in both columns, because all participants were exposed to all of the sentences. Now, just at a brief overview, when you look at this graph, I don't know about you, but the first thing I see is that the do column seems to have more dark color than the do so graph. Now, neither of them seem to have very many ratings at the level of 1, but they do so does seem to have a significant, well, a substantially larger amount of 2s and 3s compared to do, whereas do seems to have a substantially larger number of 7s and 6s as compared to do so. Now, we can visually detect this, but to look at this in a more principled way, I will present to you this graph. And I'll walk you through what it is, because I'm going to show you a few more of these sorts, or at least one more of this sort of graph. Each of the colored curves represents the probability that an individual would select a rating between 1 and 7 for the condition do so and the condition do. And so the reason they're curves is because ostensibly people will have different probabilities of selecting, for instance, a 6 for do so than for do. And we can see this, that in the do so condition, that dark blue curve at the top is slightly lower than the dark blue curve as it crosses do. And so what this visualizes for us is that there seems to be a much larger difference in the way the 7 level is used for these two. It's much lower in no condition than do condition. And conversely, the 5 level is much higher in the do so condition than in the do condition. Whereas the 1 and 2 levels, they don't appear to be appreciably different across both of them. And so the reason why this sort of visualization is useful is because it demonstrates to us that it's not just a continuous variable we're looking at. This is not a smooth change from unacceptable to acceptable. We've presented our participants with discrete choices, and those participants might interpret those choices in different ways. They might never use anything at the bottom of the scale and only use things at the top of the scale. But in aggregate, we can see that the choices they make are different in one condition than in the other. Then at the very top of the graph, there's 2 pale gray bars, and these are our confidence intervals. So because they don't overlap, without getting into the fancy statistics, they don't overlap, so that suggests that the mean values or the mean locations of where these 2 conditions should be are unlikely to be the same. So we can say that people are, in fact, treating the do so condition and the do condition differently. So that answers question 1. For question 2, we want to know whether we can determine whether there's any difference between the stative and agentive conditions for do so. So we've got a bunch of factors here, or a bunch of conditions here that aren't as relevant, but specifically if we look at the do so in the stative condition and the do so in the agentive condition, we can see that within the do so condition, they are the furthest apart, but their confidence intervals still overlap. Now that could be because we simply don't have enough data, or it could be because it's just a fluke and we can't actually tell whether or not, and they are the same, and this is just how we ended up sampling our data. However, they're very close to the edges, and so I would bet that they are potentially different. And we would just need to gather more data to sort of refine those confidence intervals. But, we'll learn in the future what is fact and what is just my hopes and dreams. But looking at the levels, it does appear that, again, level 7 seems to be fairly different between the do so in the stative condition and the do so in the agentive condition. And in contrast, 4, which is exactly at the same quality as 7 for the do so stative condition, is lower than 7 for the do so agentive condition. And this basically tells us that people are behaving differently when they're rating a do so in a stative condition and a do so in an agentive condition. Okay. But what we really care about is looking for variation and subpopulations. So what I've got here are trying to collapse a 3-dimensional space into 2 dimensions. So our 3 dimensions are how people rate agentive environments. This is now just for do so. We're going to ignore do for the time being. So within do so ratings, we have how they rate do so in agentive conditions. Our second dimension is how they rate do so in stative conditions. And the third one is how they rate do so in variable conditions. And so for each of these conditions, we can pair them up with one other and create sort of a view into the side of a 3-dimensional cube. And for each view, one axis will be one of the conditions, the other axis will be the other condition. And that third axis, it would be coming straight out of the slide towards you. But since we don't have that technology yet, we're going to ignore it for each of these 3 views. So in this first view on the left, horizontally we have the variable condition, and vertically we have the stative condition. Above it, above the points that we've plotted, our hypothesis would be that the stative condition would be either approximately rated the same as the variable condition, approximately poorly as the variable condition, or even less acceptable than the variable condition. And this is highlighted in the lower 2 quadrants in yellow. In the next set of graphs in the middle, horizontally, we have the variable condition again, and vertically, we have the agentive condition. And we would expect the agentive condition to be either rated more acceptable than the variable condition, or as good as the variable condition. And that's highlighted in the 2 yellow boxes at the top of the graph. Then finally, in the third one on the right, we have horizontally the agentive condition and vertically the stative condition. And we would guess, based on everything we know from the literature, that the stative condition should be rated more poorly, lower acceptability, than the agentive condition. And therefore, we would expect the points to be clustered in that lower right quadrant that's highlighted yellow. Looking down, a lot more variation than we predicted. And this sort of throws a wrench into the whole idea that we can confirm experimentally what we're seeing in the formal literature and in the empirical data gathered from individuals, often syntacticians. But that doesn't mean that the formal literature is wrong. It just means that there are additional factors that we need to be able to account for. And so we're going to try to do that using hierarchical cluster analysis. Now, hierarchical cluster analysis basically sorts through data that exists in multiple dimensions, and we've got 3, and tries to find which data points are most closely related to each other. So what are the shortest distances between data points? And once it identifies how these data points are clustered, if there are any, or what the distance is between each, we can draw a tree that'll look very familiar to syntacticians, but rather than being with parts of speech and phrase structure, it's going to be this abstract distance between multidimensional points. Then, once we have that, we can redo that analysis, that clustering 1,000 times, and it will look slightly different every time because the way the algorithm detects differences and compares differences may vary depending on the order in which the points are added into the algorithm. So we do that 1,000 times, and from that we can see which points are most frequently grouped together. Now those form our robust clusters. From those, we can guess that we may have found subgroups or potentially microdialects that behave the same way when they encounter these sentences. And we can backtrack to see if there's anything that we know about these participants that could then predict their membership in these clusters. And we haven't gotten to that stage yet in this research, but let's go one thing at a time, shall we? So here is what one of these clusters dendrograms would look like. And I've put the code in the top right just so that you have an idea, if you're interested in doing this, what sort of code I use to generate this tree. But each branch, it has a code associated with it. The important thing is that the further apart these clusters branch from each other, the more likely it is that they form sort of a separate family of nodes. So the red boxes indicate our robust clusters that were consistently grouped together. And we've got this one large one on the left. And we've got a couple of small ones towards the center and towards the right. But this large one on the left suggests that there is this group of people who are doing very similar things when they rate these sentences. And so what I've now done is I've taken the five enclosed groups, and I've assigned them each to a cluster. And I'll go back to that previous graph we were looking at, but I'll add in colors. All of the nodes or participants in this case that were not robustly part of one of these clusters or groups are going to be colored gray. So here we go. It's that same graph as before, but now we have our 5 clusters along with our no clusters. And I want to talk about cluster 1. That's the really big group. Cluster 1 is doing something pretty weird. They're actually doing almost the exact opposite of anything that we predicted from our initial hypotheses about how people interact with or behave when they encounter these sentences. So in this first graph on the left, that red group is almost entirely in the positive quadrant. So this suggests that they are rating stative and variable conditions as acceptable, more acceptable than they rate other conditions. And not only that, they're rating stative and variable as approximately the same. So both positive as compared to other variable ratings and positive as compared to other stative ratings. And that says that they're treating variable and stative verbs as approximately the same. Now, the only, I guess, good news to take away from this is that variable verbs are in fact stative verbs, but the literature just suggests that stative verbs shouldn't be acceptable with do so. So we've got some counter evidence for that now. In the center graph, the red group is actually centered sort of around 0, which means that they're, like, as a group, they aren't positive about agentive verbs, nor are they particularly negative. But when we compare that to variable verbs, they're very positive about variable verbs. And if we compare this to our hypotheses, well, some of those points do fall in a quadrant that we expected them to. But because we are grouping these people together based on their behaviors overall, it's really hard to say whether they are following our hypotheses or confirming our hypotheses or doing something totally different. Then finally, in the last graph on the right, group 1 is entirely above 0 or is entirely positive about stative verbs. And what this suggests, and of course we didn't expect that at all, we expected agentive verbs to be rated more positively, which would have shifted the stative verb ratings into the negative quadrants. So these people seem to be reversed. They like do so with stative verbs, and they don't like do so with agentive verbs. And they pattern variable verbs with the stative verbs. Now, this sort of blew our minds when we first encountered it, because there's not a good reason that we could think of that these particular people would be acting so counter to what the formal literature has suggested for decades, that people treat, how people treat these variable, agentive, and stative verbs in the presence of a do so anaphor. So we wanted to know whether there was actually any truth to that at all. And while the other clusters are much smaller and have many fewer members, clusters 4 and 5 give us hope that these hypotheses that we came into the study with are not to be tossed in the bin, because 4 and 5, so this is purple and blue triangles, upside down and right side up, I don't know which is which, in the left-hand graph, okay, so purple is sort of spanning the positive-negative line, but blue is very much where you'd expect it to be, where stative verbs and variable verbs are rated equally as poorly. In the center graph, agentive verbs and variable verbs, agentive verbs for both of these subgroups are rated much more highly than variable verbs. And then finally, in the third graph, the purple and blue triangles are in that predicted lower right quadrant, and therefore stative verbs have been rated much lower than agentive verbs for these people. Now, it's a very small number of people, so it's hard to draw conclusions about that. We would need to gather more data or identify which people these for other properties, what they brought into the experiment with them. But these two clusters are providing evidence for our original hypotheses, and they do seem to behave the way we expected them to. They're just not the main clusters. And it's really hard to tell what about them is so different. Okay, the final two clusters, cluster 2 and cluster 3, both exhibit sort of a combination of properties from our sort of inverse group, cluster 1, and our as predicted groups, clusters 4 and 5. And so it's not clear whether these would form a speech community of themselves or whether there are two distinct things, but these would be, this is information that we can use to return to these participants or future participants to identify whether these are robust microdialects or whether it's just a fluke. So this is where we have stopped for now due to, everything going on in the world. But there is still a lot to take away from what we've got so far. And the first thing is that this started as a pilot study. This is not a whole lot of data to work with. And it started off as a just sort of a what if we could moment. We weren't really sure where we were going to take it. Tracy had a lot of interesting ideas to do with the ways do so can be formally represented. And I had some tools that I wanted to learn and explore that could test this on a larger population to see whether we could find subtle variation within a speech community that's often treated homogenously. And from this data, we were able to extract something that I think is interesting and will help us innovate. Now, there are some limitations to this. At the moment, we don't know what caused these clusters to exist, or if we would find them again. And that's because we ended up gathering too few participants for what we ended up finding. Because we honestly expected our hypotheses to be confirmed. The more we talked about them, our judgments aligned with those hypotheses, with those two clusters, 4 and 5, as apparently had all the syntacticians who'd been working on this and publishing this literature. So we did not expect there to be so much variation. So, not quite enough data for solid conclusion yet. However, despite that, we were able to gather enough data to detect 5 robust subgroups. And this will allow us to refine the hypotheses going forward and hopefully identify what makes these subgroups behave differently when presented with the exact same stimuli. Whether it's it has to do with their geographic dialectal location, or whether it has to do with other aspects of their language history, whether it's age striated, or whether it just has something to do with their individual grammars that have slightly different arrangements of parameters, or however you want to call them, that ends up having knock-on effects that lead to these judgments in ways that we honestly totally didn't expect. So from that, the conclusions that I take away from this really should be interim conclusions, but this is that the formal theoretical models of a grammar or a grammatical system that we might call an I language are often treated as applicable across a population or speech community. So much of the work that we base our experiments and psycholinguistic analyses on comes from these formal theoretical models that are adapted by from a single syntactician's intuitions, or sometimes a small group of people's intuitions. And that these homogeneous communities that we assume are all behaving in the same way as described may have principled variation within them that goes counter to what we understand. And in that case, we have to refine our understanding of the syntactic phenomena. Not because the literature is wrong about that, but because it only applies to a smaller community, a smaller subgroup, possibly a microdialect, that isn't necessarily shared by the macro population of, say, American English, or Southern American English, or Californian American English, or any language, but I'm thinking about Englishes now because I'm working in English. So this variation that we are now able to detect, but not just that it exists, but in which ways it exists. In the past, it may have been drowned out by studying these phenomena in aggregate. When we compare individuals, we aggregate across individuals, we lose that variation. So those people who were rating sentences just sort of in the middle they aren't necessarily contributing to an acceptability, a positive acceptability, or a negative acceptability. They're just adding noise until we look at how they behave in the context of their other ratings. So then finally, using this naive algorithm to identify potential clusters could lead us to factors that we had not considered could be influencing the rest of the grammatical behavior. So these naive algorithms, they don't know anything about syntax. They just look at these abstract distances between the points we feed them, and they say, oh, these two are close together. These two are really far apart. I bet these two form a cluster and these two don't. But if you're doing that in 3 dimensions, it's very difficult to do that in a principled way. Then add on statistical analysis or statistical evaluation, we can determine which groups have robust enough clustering that they could be potentially considered independent groups. Then the next step, of course, would be backtracking and figuring out what factors could condition these clusters, if any, or whether they're just flukes. And the next time we run this experiment, we get a whole different set of clusters from maybe even the same individuals. And in which case, all of that variation is noise. And the most informative thing would be to look in aggregate, to chuck out the noise and see what signals we can detect in it. But as I said, this is a first step. This is a coarse grain, low grit sandpaper, beginning to look at how to detect microdialects within a speech population that had been assumed to be homogeneous, with the exception of our question about this variable condition, this variably acceptable state of verb. And so I'll end there. If you're interested in the bibliography or anything, let me know. I can send you my slides. And keep an eye out for this paper, which hopefully will be published in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. And now we have plenty of time for questions or comments by the audience here. So just use the icon to raise your hand, and then you can, I think, unmute yourselves.
I see a question in the chat already. Should I answer that one? So this I use 7 values like it, and there's a good answer and there's a bad answer. The bad answer is because it's a common number of points on a Likert scale. The better answer is that I find 7-point Likert scales allow a little bit more practice for participants, and this is a bit anecdotal, but any more, and participants tend to get overwhelmed with the number of choices they're giving. And any fewer, participants, when asked about the rating, will say, oh, I wish there had been a value in between 4 and 5. Like, it's not as good as a 5, but 4 is too low. And so by adding that extra 2 steps into the scale, I find that it gives participants enough flexibility to say, yes, this is definitely in the middle. This is on the middle side of high. This is on the low side of high. This is on the low side of middle or the high side of low, if that makes sense.
Raised hand. But yourself if you want and ask the question. Self, but Lauren. Myself.
So it another chat question, perhaps. Okay, and then Angel. Okay, so naive question, did the large red group simply get the 1 to 7 scale in the opposite direction if the results were the exact opposite? Strangely enough, no, they didn't. So this this task was embedded in an experiment that conducted several different parallel experiments at the same time. And there was no group that got the scale just the wrong way around. We had comprehension checks and we had other sorts of checks throughout. And that gives me fairly high confidence in saying that they just felt differently about these sentences to how we would expect. I mean, truly, it blows my mind that these people exist, since apparently they do, and apparently enough of them do, that they all behave this particular way. Their behavior on this task, on this experiment, to their behavior on the other tasks that were interwoven with these stimuli. I don't see anything holding them all together. It's just what they thought. So, Angel, is that your hand raised?
Rather general question. I mean, you were talking about clustering, creating clusters, and then you have to think what kind of this. I mean, what's the relevant parameter you want to discuss the distance or the distances of the points that you're trying to cluster. I mean, is there any I don't know. I don't know if I should use the word theory. Is there any guidelines or theories or things that you have thought of that should be taken into account in order to think that I want to measure the distance? I mean, I want to measure the distance between these two things with respect to a relevant notion or a relevant phenomenon or a relevant feature or something like that. Is there anything like general guidelines or something that you are trying to work out?
So I have to admit, I myself am a little bit new to hierarchical cluster analysis, so I may not be able to give you a complete answer. But what I can say is that the algorithm that I've used to calculate the distances is theory naive. It is ignorant to any sort of syntactic theory. However, there is a lot of mathematical and statistical theory that goes into it. And so I highly recommend reading Dagmar Divyak's paper on hierarchical clustering, because she goes through exactly what these distances are and how they're calculated, or how we might calculate them with respect to different linguistic phenomena. So you can calculate it in terms of string edit distance, for instance, for orthography or pronunciation. In this case, it's based on the Likert scale. So the distance is based on a 1 to 7 value that was given by our participants, and then normalized based on each participant's use of the scale. So I think I might be able to share. Can you see a new window that's not one of my slides? Can you give me a thumbs up? The sound seems to be stuttering. Or, oh, okay, cool. So here we have a 3D model of the space in which these points are located. And the axes are let's see if I can get this right. The axes represent this abstract distance between points based on the ratings that each individual, which is represented by a point, gave for each of the tokens that they were presented with. So I would not interpret the numbers, but we can see that there are people who are close in, let's say, in one dimension. All of these people are nearly overlapping, but in another dimension, they span the whole range of the ratings. And so what we can tell from that is, I think this speaks to your question, hopefully, is that the distance along one axis is not necessarily contingent on the distance along another axis. So what we can say is that visually, and this is where the algorithm becomes such a useful tool, because if I had just looked at the graph like this, where we had seem appear on one axis and tend happen on another axis, and I saw these participants, so 620 and I think it's 39 in the back, I would assume that they're all doing the exact same thing. But when we look at this along the tend, happen, and claim, pretend axis, we can see 39, 20, and 6 are, spread out a lot. And so from a theoretical perspective, we can say that these three people are treating seem, appear, and tend to happen in the exact same way relative to each other and can be differentiated in the way they treat claim and pretend. So it's not that their ratings for claim and pretend are contingent on their ratings for seem or appear or tend and happen. Rather, there is another factor at play that differentiates their behavior. It's not the most satisfying answer, but hopefully this gives you a more tangible perspective on how this three-dimensional space, like we can't do it as humans with human vision and human intuition. We really do need this naive tool to come in and tell us that certain clusters exist and certain and can work backwards. And perhaps if I had gathered more data about the language histories of these participants, we could find out that in fact these overlapping people might have something in common. Unfortunately, I didn't gather that data. I did not anticipate this rich of a data set, and so that's my mistake.
Answer. Maybe that reference you mentioned, Lauren, you can add it to the PowerPoint when we ask, for the presentation, so that we can upload it at some point.
Yes, absolutely. So it's right here. It's the first one on this slide. It's Dagmar Divjak and Nick Fieller's 2014 paper, but that's there. It's in the bibliography. I'm happy to share that information.
Question in the chat, and then one raised hand. Maybe we can start with the question in the chat.
Okay, so have I tried to collapse the 7 values into only 3 groups? For instance, 1, 2, 6, 7, and all the rest. I have not, and I have a good reason why not. And that is because there are going to be people who conceptualize the scale not as 1, 2, 6, 7, and middle, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there's no way to know how an individual will split up that scale and assign values to that scale because each individual treats that scale in a different way. The solution is a sophisticated sounding statistical operation, which is just a lot of linear regressions all smushed into one. And that's called a cumulative link mixed model, and that's a linear regression that treats ordinal data as each level being distinct from each other level, now, but in an ordered fashion. And with this, we're able to tell that 1 is treated different from 2, and 2 is treated different from 3, etc., etc. And there's variation across people, but because each of these levels has the same ordering for each person. It's not that people are saying that 3 is actually a lower rating than 6 in some conditions. We're able to detect their behaviors differently, or how their behaviors differ across these. And so then turning them into these more categorical groups, like you suggest, ends up losing some of that information. It is possible to do this, but then we might lose. So if I go back to the slide, let's stick with Yeah, actually, let's do this one. It's nice and simple. There's not a whole lot of lines making it busy. I say nice and simple, but it's still a bit of a conceptual mess. We can see that the line for 6 that suggests its probability for do so and do being selected by individuals is so different from the line for 7. And in fact, 7 has more overlap with 4 or 5 than does 6. So grouping 7 and 6 together doesn't end up making any sense. 6 and 7 are being treated in very different ways. Now, to that same question, maybe 1, 2, and 3 are sufficiently similar. All 3 of them have very low probabilities. It could be that grouping 1, 2, and 3 together does allow us a more nuanced dive into the other levels, but I still wouldn't suggest doing that. I hope that answers your question.
One last question. I think there was one raised hand, so that person can unmute.
Hey, yeah, I think this is sort of a maybe naive-ish question about what these models can do, but I think it's a really cool idea. And I guess I just kind of wonder how it compares to sort of going in and having your, dependent variables of like, age could be a factor and your dialect group could be a factor. And is this like a preferable way of doing it? Like, do you think it's a preferable way of doing it? Or
Absolutely not. I think that this is a good way of exploring and looking for factors that you aren't certain contribute. If you have a hypothesis that age or that dialect or that race or some aspect of language background is going to contribute, then that actually this approach could potentially end up losing some of that detail. On the other hand, just running this sort of analysis doesn't mean that you're getting rid of that other data. So for instance, if you had a strong hypothesis for certain age categories or social networks, if you already knew that certain people were in certain social networks and therefore were more likely to produce this variant and more likely to produce another variant, and you wanted to confirm that these people were actually behaving differently, could potentially demonstrate what you already know, that these people are in different social networks and therefore are behaving, if that makes sense. However, this does not replace any of the traditional or common analyses, and it certainly is not better than identifying your factors ahead of time. The real use here is when you've identified some factors and you just don't know how other factors might influence the outcome, but you suspect that there are others. And so in our case, we know that there's this variation in the way people rate do-so sentences for seems and appears. But why? Throw our hands up in the air, we don't know. And so trying to see whether we could even find variation, we found much more variation than we expected. But now, as I said, we'd backtrack. And it's not that we would backtrack and try to formulate hypotheses about this data post hoc. Rather, what we would do is formulate hypotheses and gather new data, and then test to see whether those hypotheses, based on what we observe in this pilot, are consistent, and whether we can still detect those clusters based on our predefined factors.
Question, I think, Andrea Menegotto, you want to go ahead and ask it?
¿Se escucha ahora?
Ask your question in English.
Yes, can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm very excited with your presentation. It's really mind-blowing. But I'm wondering, what does this 7-point Likert scale mean theoretically? I mean, from the grammatical point of view. I mean, maybe what I feel like doing with your data is collapsing the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 together, and leaving 1 and 7 apart, because 1 and 7 are the only ones who said, well, they have categorical answers. It's grammatical, it's acceptable, or it's unacceptable. So they fit within the theory. The ones that don't fit within the theory are the ones in between, because what does it mean to be slightly unacceptable? Or so maybe if you to polish that coarse-grained analysis, maybe you can see what happens in between. But it's great. It's very interesting. You know, it's a very interesting way to analyze syntax.
And you have hit on the gold mine question, the $1 million question. I absolutely agree with you that we do. It's not clear what it means for something to be sort of acceptable or sort of unacceptable. But at the same time, when we start looking at actual behaviors and not, when we move away from the formal models and start looking at these weird meat creatures with jello brains and electricity running through them, the humans, all of that falls apart. People are really, really variable in their answers. And this includes even when you give them a forced choice 2 categories to choose from. And I've actually got a paper looking at this. A lot of as well as there's a bunch of really interesting work by John Sprouse and Tal Linzen and Carson Schutze on what these sorts of grammatical tasks are actually looking at. And on one side of the equation, the answer is we don't know. And so when we don't have a good reason to be looking at this slight variation in judgments, there's not really a good reason to be asking for things on a Likert scale. Why not just ask which one's better? But at the same time, more often than not, even when you're reading these formal papers, people discuss a gradient nature or a decreased acceptability without it being fully unacceptable or fully ungrammatical. And so a great example of this could be something like resumptive pronouns, where in English, resumptive pronouns are intrusive, and people produce them all of the time, even when they're like not just as speech errors, but even in carefully planned speech, people will produce them. And depending on where they fall in the sentence, what sort of resumption it is, whether it's a processing phenomenon or whether it's within an island, which is a bit of a mystery still, they rate them wildly differently. And some of them are very consistently rated poorly. And some of them are very consistently rated mediocre. And the mediocre ones, if we only had the yes or no, we would lose this fascinating insight into determining which of them are okay versus which of them are ungrammatical, just straight up bad. And it turns out the ones that are straight up bad are the ones that are in island violations. And the ones that are okay tend to have processing explanations. And so being able to distinguish something from being a processing phenomenon and a grammatical phenomenon is a really hot topic right now. So I guess to wrap this up in short, there are lots of reasons why we wouldn't care whether something is at a 2 versus a 3, and we'd only want the two far ends of the scale. But on the other hand, sometimes the two far ends of the scale lose a lot of nuance that could inform the theory even further. So it really, really depends on your question and what sort of framework you're working with, whether you are looking at the human behavioral, psychological processing aspects, or whether you're just looking at the model of one grammar that you're trying to describe, and then of course everything in between.
I think we can leave it here. We could stay longer, and I think the longer we stayed, the more questions we would get for you. So let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Lauren, again.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is it for today. We will resume tomorrow morning for the talk by Inés Fernández Ordóñez, which is taking place at 10:30 a.m. So we will start around 10:20 a.m. tomorrow morning. Okay. So thanks everyone for attending, and see you tomorrow.